All right. Hi, everyone. Sorry. Again, I'm Christine Hooks, Chair of Friends of Hollin HIlls. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a virtual discussion with Dennis Carmichael on native trees for the Hollin HIlls landscape. Um, for any of you who maybe don't read all of your emails, I just want to let you know that we did make a slight adjustment. We initially intended for today's program to cover both native trees and shrubs, but when Dennis put the lovely presentation together, it turned out that we thought it would be a little bit too long to do in a single Sunday afternoon. So today he's just going to cover native trees, and he has graciously offered to do a second presentation next month on native shrubs. So if you're interested in shrubs and you have any questions about shrubs rather than trees, you can still submit them here, and we'll try to save them and ask him at the next session. But we probably won't get to those shrub-specific questions today. I have a few more people trying to enter, so I'll wait another minute or two to admit people, and then I'll let Dennis get started. All right, so I will start with just a quick introduction of Dennis. So Dennis Carmichael, I don't know, Dennis, I'm sorry, the acronyms you have, do you just pronounce those? FASLA and
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, FASLA means a fellow in the American Society of Landscape Architects. It's our professional organization.
okay, great. And lead AP is, so Dennis is a licensed landscape architect with 45 years of experience, spending most of his career with EDAW in Alexandria. His work has served as a catalyst for the revitalization of many American cities, including Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta, Wharf District Park in Boston, and the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville. Locally, he designed the landscape for the US Patent and Trademark Office, John Carlyle Square, Potomac Yard Park, Sallie Mae, and Discovery Channel headquarters. He's currently leading the design of a 1-mile long deck park over the Interstate Highway in Midtown Atlanta. Dennis has received over 40 design awards, and his work has been published in such magazines as Landscape Architecture, Urban Land, and Architecture. He's served as national president of the American Society of Landscape Architects and also the Landscape Architecture Foundation. So we are very pleased to have Dennis with us today, and he's put together a fabulous presentation. I will see if I can turn off my screen sharing, and then I can let Dennis take over. All right, I have stopped sharing, so Dennis, it's all you.
Okay. Now, I assume everyone can hear me and see my screen.
Yes.
We'll just have to take that as a yes.
Yes.
So what you see here on the screen is a view from the inside of the Hollin HIlls house. And we all came to Hollin HIlls for the architecture, and we admire it, and we have come to appreciate mid-century modern architecture. But what we also all signed up for, whether we knew it or not, was to become managers of the forest. So what today's talk is going to be about is understanding what are those trees that are out there, and what is a native tree, and why is it important? But also get into a discussion about if you are thinking of adding trees to your yard, what should you add, where, and why? So that's really the nature of this discussion. The source material for all of this comes from the Missouri Botanical Garden website. And I've used lots of websites to do research on plants over the years. This is actually the best one. And it's the best because it has the most concise and useful information about all species of plants, trees, shrubs, ground covers, perennials, etc. And today we're only going to be talking about trees. But it also is all about science. They're not trying to sell you anything. It's just pure fact. So you'll see an example of that for every tree species that I talk about here in a second. And why is it not advancing? Okay, now do you see the native trees for Hollin Hills cover?
Yes, I see the cover. Are you able to advance? And there we go.
Yes.
It made it to the next slide.
Thankfully. Okay, sorry for that. So first I want to start off with some definitions because there are terms here that are used that some people understand and others that they don't understand. So first of all, native plant is a plant that is naturally occurring and by the federal definition, naturally occurring in the US before came here. Now, an indigenous plant is a plant within ecoregion. So that Pacific area. So for example, we're in the Piedmont Mid-Atlantic ecoregion. So an indigenous plant is a narrower focused native plant. In other words, there are native plants that are native to, let's say, the entire US, let's say the Midwest, that we can use here freely because it's the same plant zone, but they are not indigenous. An exotic or alien plant is a plant that is not naturally occurring. That means it came here from some other place, typically Asia or Europe. And there's lots of those that we have here in Hollin Hills, maybe more than you think. A naturalized plant is an exotic plant that came here through some means and thrived here. And an example of that is, a good example of that is the Japanese cherry. We all love Japanese cherries, but they're not from here. But they have accommodated and acclimated themselves to this planting zone and this climate, and they do quite well. And they're not invasive, so they're okay. Now, an invasive plant is a naturalized or exotic plant that gets here and then takes over uncomfortably, crowds things out, reduces biodiversity, and actually harms the environment. There is probably not a single Hollin Hills home that does not have an invasive. And you all know what they are. It's ivy and bamboo and wisteria and honeysuckle and euonymus. And most of our yards have some of them. So, and they are bad. And we know that we need to manage them, control them, and eventually eradicate them. Part of that is what's going on in the plans for the two stream valleys here in Hollin Hills to remove and reduce the amount of invasive plants. So why should you plant or learn about native plants? Well, for one thing, they require less water and fertilizers and pesticides because they are part of this environment. And what that means is less work. And it also, over the life of a tree, means less money. It will cost you less to take care of a tree over its life if it's native than if it's not. Now, that being said, if you plant a native tree, I'm not saying that you can just throw it in the ground and walk away. You still have to water it and until the roots get established. And generally, that's up to the first 5 years. So you're not off the hook and you still have to take care of things. But once these trees get established, they don't really need any other inputs. Native plants are well suited for the heavy clay soils that we have. And we know we have very unsuitable soils. And yet things grow here. And if all you have to do is walk through Paul Spring Park or some of the Stream Valley parks, and you know which species are doing well and which ones aren't there. And it's because they've put up with the soil and they can thrive even under these conditions. Native plants provide habitat for insects and animals in terms of food and shelter. And you only have to think about oak trees. If you have oaks, you have acorns. If you have acorns, you have squirrels. So it's all part of the complete ecosystem that these trees provide those services. Native plants don't spread aggressively, but they do cluster effectively. And you'll see these in several kinds of trees. Most notably now, you might think about redbuds. Redbuds are in bloom right now, and along certain roadways where they had been recently cleared. Redbud is what is called a volunteer species. It's one of the first ones to go in disturbed sites, and they do have a tendency to colonize. But they're not invasive. They don't destroy the ecology, but they do spread uh, uh, throughout a given area. Native plants can provide food and medicines for humans, and they can also serve as pollinators. And pollinator is a word that many of you probably have heard of, and maybe you don't quite understand it, but it is the fact that the, the seeds and the pollen that forms the seeds for the continuing plant life are spread by birds and butterflies and bees, and we need all those insects. We need them to thrive, and that's how plants reproduce. And what we have also been reading is there has been a drastic reduction in the number of bees in America. So this is a problem. And how you do that, or what you can do about that locally, is you can plant species that are pollinator species, and that provides food for these insects. So it's all good. It's all part of the full chain of uh, any ecosystem. Okay, now we're going to go in a series of categories. The first category is shade trees, which are large trees. The image on the right is the page from the Missouri Botanical Gardens sheet, and you'll note that the top uh, listing is done alphabetically in Latin. It's the scientific name. And you say, well, why is it in Latin? Because the Latin name is the scientific name that is known all around the world. And so if you say Acer rubrum, anybody from anywhere knows that means red maple. Red maple has many, many common names. So that's why you should not rely upon the common name if you really want the specific species. You need to get familiar with a scientific name. Well, of course, I don't expect any of you to know these names, because how would you? But if you go to the Botanical Garden website, you can do a plant finder and you type in red maple, and it'll take you to this page. And it's just how they have organized them. So don't be surprised when you see Latin names used in the literature. And the great thing about these sheets, and this is a section of one of the whole sheets that describes the tree, it tells you what zone it's in. And in this case, it's zone 3 to 9. Just so you know, we are in planting zone about 6.5, which is the Piedmont area of the Mid-Atlantic. And every tree that I have in this presentation is fit for this zone. So any of these trees that you see here would be appropriate for your yard. I've pre-selected that for you. And then it gives you the height and the spread and the bloom time and the bloom description, whether it's big, small, bright, whatever. Very critically, it tells you whether a tree needs sun or not sun, how much water it needs. And water in this case means how much do you need to water it. And this will say, in this case, it says medium to wet. Sometimes it's going to say dry or drought tolerant. Maintenance is low. Suggested use, it tells you all of that, blah, blah, blah. And then the last one is actually quite important: tolerate. And what this is saying, it tolerates wet soil and air pollution. Well, guess what we have in Hollin HIlls? We have wet soil and air pollution. So we do live in a metropolitan region. So as bucolic as it is, we live in an urban airshed. So that is a reality of the world. But also, one of the geniuses of red maple is it thrives in wet soil. It can even be in a rain garden. It can have periodic standing water. So it's one of those great trees for our neighborhood. Two other things that are worth talking about from the aesthetic point of view: it has brilliant red color, bright, bright, bright red. But it also has a bright red flower. It's the first tree to flower. It flowers in late February. So as everything else is completely bare and gray, the red maple is the first sign that spring is on the way before anything green shoots out. Next tree you probably would not have heard of. It's called the hackberry, Celtus occidentalis. I put this in here because it is a undersung tree. It also takes heavy clay soil. It takes wet soil and urban conditions. It's a great street tree. It's a great forest tree. And it has a kind of irregular uh, canopy, which is also wonderful. It has a great sort of what you might call winter profile. When the leaves are off, it has a sculptural kind of character to it, and it has a very rough scabrous bark. So even the bark of it is of interest. It's a plant that you could plant close enough to your home where you could see the bark. But like, I guess what I would say is, as a general rule, any of these shade trees, which grow anywhere between 40 to 80 feet tall, you should never plant any closer than 10 feet to your house. And 10 feet is really close. You're better off with 20, because we all know that trees drop branches and sometimes bad things happen. But we all know that most of our houses have trees that are even closer than that to our homes. But as a good forest management strategy, you generally should never plant any tree closer than 10 feet. Glycemic tricanthos, honey locust. You might know this tree. It's a very common street tree. It is also a retailer's ideal. And by that, I mean, it has a very loose, light, leafy kind of canopy that makes it wonderful for retail situations where you want to be able to see the signs of the stores. So you'll see it used constantly in shopping centers and on streets that are retail streets. Um, it also, besides having a very fine texture, very light canopy, it has this sort of unique attribute of that it actually has almost a square shape to it. If you look in the picture on the left, you can see it naturally forms a flat top. So it's one of the architect's most favorite trees, because if architects are dealing with flat roofed buildings and very geometric settings, the honey locust sort of conforms to that. It almost looks like it's been sheared on the top occasionally. Liquid ambar styrosiphylla, this is sweet gum. It is a great tree for the forest, a great background tree. It has brilliant fall color. It's reasonably fast growing. It is not a tree that you should plant anywhere near your driveway or your lawn. Why is that? I'm sure if I asked you, every hand would raise. Gumballs. We all know about gumballs. They're horrible. And that's the fruit of a sweet gum. So as wonderful as that is, and as great as that is for the wildlife, it's a pain for humans. You cannot walk in bare feet on your lawn if you have a sweet gum tree. So if you like a sweet gum, I'm just saying don't plant it near any places where you want to be walking, because it clogs your lawnmower. You can't walk in bare feet. It's a bit of a pain, but a great tree within a forest setting. Liriodendron, commonly known as the tulip tree. Its signature aspect, besides the kind of mitten-shaped leaves, the sort of octagonal-shaped leaves you see in the detail photograph, is it has the straightest trunk of any tree. And so next time you're walking in Great Falls or the Shenandoah or Prince William Forest Park, and you see a tree trunk that is dead straight and the foliage is about 40 feet in the air, you look up, it's going to be a tulip tree, because that's what tulip trees do. They find the sunlight in the middle of a forest, and how they do that is with a very, very straight trunk. And they're beautiful for that. It's a very smooth bark, and that's the signature of it, is the straightness of it. It also has a very narrow profile. So this is a tree that you could plant sort of near your house, with the sense that the branches would not necessarily grow over your rooftop, for example. And this is Sylvatica. This is known as black gum. You may not have heard of this tree. This is also another architect's dream tree, because the branches are almost purely horizontal. If you see this tree portrait on the left side, imagine those leaves going away. It has a very striking winter profile. So yes, it does lose its leaves, but it still is very beautiful and sculptural, and in fact holds the snow in a very beautiful way. So when you think about winter profile, sometimes you think, well, nothing matters, but it does. And especially in a very architectural setting, such as Hollin Hills, where you have flat roofed buildings and very horizontal lines in the landscape, you might consider a tree like this adjacent or near your house. Also has fabulous fall color, very small leaves, and it loves having wet feet. So it could be in a rain garden or in the low point of your yard or in a place where you have standing water issues because of the heavy clay. Now, I will say this is a fairly slow growing tree. So you got to be very patient. And if you were to plant this tree, I wouldn't plant it as a seedling. I would plant it as, a tree that's 8 to 10 feet tall already, so that it becomes something in your lifetime. And that is a criteria for thinking about trees, is that they do take time to grow. Sycamore, Platinus occidentalis, is a great tree. You probably are familiar with this tree. Its signature aspect, besides a very organic shape, which it almost always gets, they start out regular and become irregular, is that the bark exfoliates over time. And what that means is what you begin to see is the cambium layer below, and it's all white, or the outer bark, I should say. It's not really exposing the cambium, but the outer bark sheds and it becomes.
I didn't get that. Try tapping above to edit.
As it loses that bark, it becomes a sort of white sculptural element. What I'll also say, it's a fairly messy tree. If you have it in your yard, it does drop a lot of branches. Almost every windstorm, it will drop a bunch of branches. It has a fruit that is fairly large, that when it falls, it covers the ground with litter. So you have to keep up after it. Now I'm going to segue into a series of oaks. If I had any advice to any Hollin Hill homeowner, it's plant an oak. We live in the oak hickory forest. That's the ecoregion in which we live, and it is the most dominant tree and most long-lived tree. Of these, white oak is probably the one that's the most stately. It's a tree that can stand alone as a single specimen. You can see here in this photograph on the left. But it also is quite comfortable in the woods. It'll grow with a narrower profile. It does not have a striking fall color, but mostly its majesty is its long life. That's what it is best known for. Quercus palustris is pin oak. This is a much smaller oak. It's faster growing. And again, this is another architect's dream plant because it has a very regular canopy. And if you planted 10 of these in a row, they all kind of look like each other. Whereas the white oak, every white oak is different from every other white oak. Whereas pin oaks look very regular. And the characteristic of this tree is the middle branches are horizontal, the lower branches point down, the upper branches sort of angle up in a very regular pattern. So again, you probably have seen these trees on college campuses or business campuses, where the idea of a repetitive tree along a street or even in a parking lot is a good idea. These trees are very good at repeating that pattern. It also will tolerate wet soil, and most oaks do not. Most oaks like to be high and dry. Willow oak, Quercus fellows, is another one that actually is quite happy with wet feet. You know this tree if you've been to Holland Meadows School. It's the very large trees that are out in front, right at the front door at that auto court drop off. Beautiful, tall, more upright than the white oaks or the red oaks, with a much finer leaf. It's a very thin, attenuated kind of leaf, as opposed to the thicker or more lobed white or red oaks. But again, its major attribute is it can take wet soil. Red oak is a wonderful tree. There's several of these. There's bur oak and scarlet oak and nuttall oak. They're all fall within the category of red oak, and they have wonderful fall color. Oaks generally do not have wonderful fall color. They generally sort of turn brownish or yellowish, but the red oaks do have a signature red color. Not as brilliant as Nyssa or as red maple, but still for the oaks, it's as bright as they get. Again, this one does not like wet feet. It has to be high and dry. Tilia americana is, they call it here American linden. You might also know it as basswood. It's also a tree that is very, what I would call sculptural. Its branching habit is very organic, and no two basswoods are the same. They all look unique and different. They have very striking, besides their branching habit, a very striking fall color. And they are capable of standing alone as a specimen tree, or they can also be found within a forest. And American elm is a native. And of course, you've seen this on the National Mall. Everyone knows American elm. And what you would say is, wait a minute, doesn't that get Dutch elm disease? Shouldn't we not be thinking about that? There, there are now clones of Ulmus americana, the LA elm and the Liberty elm, that are immune to Dutch elm disease. And they are the ones that are being replanted along the mall. I have planted them, in fact, at the US Patent and Trademark Office. Those are all LA elms in that project, and they're doing fine. So it is a beautiful tree. It is the most majestic of the street trees. It grows to be about 80 feet tall, and it has a very characteristic vase-like shape. So you get lots of light that comes down through it, but shade underneath. Okay, now we're going to switch to minor trees. These are trees that you would plant underneath the canopy. So in many Hollin Hills homes, you have trees that are 80 feet in the air and the canopy is way up there. So what do you do underneath them? Well, here's a few of those minor trees. Pawpaw is a tree you might know, you might not. And I put it in here again because it likes wet feet. Betula nigra is river birch. This is a tree we're seeing a lot more. It's becoming much more commercially available. Its main attribute is this beautiful exfoliating bark. It's a sort of a tannish, orangish bark that when it peels away, reveals a very mottled bark underneath. And is probably its best attribute is probably in winter. It looks the most striking in the dead of winter. It's the kind of tree where you'd want to plant it in front of evergreens or a more consistent dark background to highlight its foreground. And it typically comes in multi-stems. It grows both in the wild and commercially as a multi-stemmed tree. American hornbeam is a great tree that you may or may not be aware of. It has a very regular habit, very dense branching, very fine texture. And you might, if you know it by its other common names, ironwood or musclewood. And it's because the bark has this very voluptuous kind of sculptural quality that's really, really beautiful. And you've seen this if you've been to Dunbarton Oaks and the area that's called the Ellipse, that aerial hedge, those are hornbeams. And they are a perfect tree for that application because of their dense branching and their very fine foliage. Yellowwood is a wonderful tree that is very underplanted. It's an unsung hero, I think. I always find myself comparing it to a child's drawing of a tree. It's a lollipop. It's one of the few trees that its height is equal to its spread. So it almost is a perfect sort of globe or sphere in its ultimate characteristic. And it branches very low. It starts branching about 6 to 8 to 10 feet. So it doesn't become this sort of massive tree that grows up to 80 feet. It's much more at a human scale. It's the kind of tree you could plant in a courtyard or in a setting close to your house where you want to be able to see the sculptural qualities of the branching patterns, but still get shade. Hop hornbeam is another sort of undersung tree. It's a great tree for understory, for again, up close texture and understory shade. If you have a situation where your canopy trees are way up in the air and you find that you need another level of scale and shade at the human scale, this is a good tree to tuck underneath. Sumac is a tree that, again, many people think of it as kind of a weed. And there is some literature that says it's invasive, but most literature says no, it's just it is, and it is native. Um, and it's an aggressive colonizer. You see it along railroad rights of way and highway rights of way. It's kind of like redbud in that it's a volunteer. It's one of the first trees to come in a disturbed site, and it spreads by suckers, so it does spread aggressively. But it has excellent food qualities for the birds, brilliant fall color, and then brilliant winter. The seed pods linger over the winter and provide a splash of color and beauty. And it's very sculptural. The trees are very organically shaped, and you don't normally see them like in this photograph here as a singular tree. More often you see them in clusters, but they're really, really beautiful in that cluster. And they have an almost tropical feel to them, which is another reason why I like it. Sassafras is a great understory tree. You can see here in its classical form, it spreads by root suckers and it colonizes. It has a very unique mitten-shaped leaf, and its claim to fame is that if you take those leaves and you dry them, that is called filet. And if you've ever heard of filet gumbo, this is the filet that makes gumbo thick. So if you have a sassafras tree out in your backyard, you already have one ingredient for your gumbo. Taxodium, bald cypress is called Taxodium disticum. You think of it as the tree that you see in the Louisiana swamps, and it is, but it also is a fabulous tree that grows here. It tolerates wet feet, of course, but it has a very light, delicate foliage to it. But it is a interesting phenomenon. It is a deciduous conifer. And you remember from 7th grade science that a conifer is a tree that has needles like pine trees and spruces. And cypress does have the fine needles, but they drop. It has brilliant fall color, very sort of rust colored color here in about late November. Then it does lose its leaves, its needles. And I will tell you, every time I planted this, I get a panicked phone call in December from the client saying, "Oh my God, my pine tree is dying." And it's like, no, it's a cypress. It loses its leaves. They're going to come back. Don't worry. But it is a beautiful tree. And like I say, it takes wet feet. So that's a great attribute. Okay, now we're on to flowering trees. Amalekia canadensis is serviceberry. You may or may not know this. There's lots of these around Hollin Hills. It's not the showiest of trees. It's not as showy as a dogwood or a redbud, but it is a quietly beautiful tree. It is a multi-stemmed tree, typically has a very delicate white flower. Those flowers should start coming out probably next week or the week after. It always follows redbuds and dogwoods in its cycle, but its most striking attribute is its fall color. It has a brilliant red-orange color, and it just sort of lights up the understory of the forest. So when you're walking in a forest in the fall and all the trees overhead have the color, this will be the tree that'll be at eye level with that brilliant color. And Cercis canadensis is a Latin name for redbud. We probably all know redbud. There are tons of them in Hollin Hills, and they are native. They do, as you see in the little photo on the right-hand side, how they colonize, and they do spread by root suckers. But they also serve as specimens. They have this wonderful magenta, purple, pink, whatever you call that color, that is an electric color, and it's the most unique of all the colors. It's out right now. It's sort of past peak at the moment, but it's very, very striking. And what's striking about it is the petals follow the branches. So it's a very linear flowering pattern, almost very sculptural as well. And even its winter profile is quite sculptural. In fact, the most boring time of year for a redbud is summer. It just sort of sits there like a lump and has no, you lose the delicacy of the branching pattern. Here's one you may or may not know. Chionanthus, it's called fringe tree or smoke tree. And the portrait on the left-hand side captures it in full bloom, has a very delicate, almost diaphanous kind of flower that's very large and comprised of lots of little flowerets, which makes it look like it's smoke. And especially when the wind is blowing, it actually takes on this sort of almost mysterious or ethereal kind of quality. Grows as a multi-stem tree. It likes full sun if you want to get the blooming, and you wouldn't plant it unless you really wanted to get the blooming. So it's not a tree you would plant in the middle of your forest or underneath, or in a dense shade area, because you would want to get those blooms. But it is a tree you could plant in a small courtyard or within view of one of your rooms. Dogwood, everyone knows dogwood. It is a fabulous tree. It survives in both sun and shade. If it is in sun, you're going to have to give it a little extra care in the first couple of years because it tends to fry, and you'll need to water it and keep it healthy, but it flowers more aggressively if it is sunny. In general, its habitat is as an understory tree within the forest, but it doesn't flower as aggressively as it does when it's in full sun. Hawthorn is a tree, I put it in here because it is such a tough tree, and it takes all these things like drought and clay soil and air pollution. It has delicate white flowers. It has brilliant fall color. What else does it have? It has thorns, and these are wicked thorns. So do not plant this if you have young children. Do not to plant this near any walks or any driveways or anywhere where human beings go. But as a background tree, as an understory tree, it's a really good tree. Witch hazel is also another undersung tree. Its main attribute is it flowers when everything else is dormant. It flowers kind of in December or even January. It's your off-kilter plant, and it flowers in this sort of very delicate multi-petal flowers. It's a very heavy multi-stemmed kind of thing. It's almost more like a shrub than a tree, but if you have it, you would start it as a shrub, let it go, and you'd have to prune it into tree form. Magnolia Virginiana. Everybody knows magnolias. You think of southern magnolia and saucer magnolia and star magnolia. Well, none of those are natives. They're all from China. The one that you don't know is Sweet Bay Magnolia, and this is a native. It is not as showy as its cousin, the southern magnolia. It is evergreen, but its flowers are not that showy. Area of your yard where nothing seems to grow and everything is going, everything is getting swamped. Sourwood is a tree that, again, I show this because it flowers in the summer. That's its main difference from the other ones and a reason for consideration. Now we're in the last category here of evergreen trees. And there actually are not that many evergreen native trees. There are tons and tons and tons of evergreen trees, but there aren't that many that are native. Of those, probably the best one for what you might consider using it for is the American holly, Ilex opaca. And what I say there is you think of evergreen trees as screening, blocking the view of your nosy neighbor into your kitchen so they don't see your dirty dishes. So this is the tree portrait on the left shows you what this looks like when you buy it in a nursery. It actually grows to a much more organic kind of shape and form in an understory condition in the woods. So if you've been walking in Paul Spring or any of the Stream Valley parks, this is the evergreen that you see there, besides the ones that are not natives, but this will be the native one. And it's quite beautiful. It's quite durable. It's really tough. It does not like wet feet, though. Junipers virginiana, eastern red cedar. This is kind of a scraggly tree. A lot of people look at it and say, oh, isn't that thing that grows out in the fields, out in the Piedmont, in between the farmers' plowed fields? Yes, it is. It's that volunteer tree that grows in the worst soils in full sun. It's the first thing that pops up, but its genius is exactly that. And also it keeps its leaves and its green mass all the way to the base. So when you plant it as a screening plant, it stays as a screening plant. It does not like wet feet though. It likes to be high and dry. So as a counterpoint, this is Pinus strobus, which is eastern white pine. Everyone knows pine trees. Those are Christmas trees, right? Of course. And the image on the left-hand side shows a tree in its best form. About 10 years into a pine's life, it looks beautiful and it is screening all the way to the ground. After about year 10, the bottom branches start dying out because the tree is growing and the lower branches are being shaded out. By the time you get to year 20 or year 25, all of a sudden, the very reason you bought that pine tree was for screening goes away because you can see underneath it. So just consider that when you think about pine trees. And then the less regular and smaller version of a native pine here is the Virginia pine. And you can see it has a much more organic kind of quality to it, less rigid, tall, and it grows very slowly, where eastern white pine grows it loses its lower level screening. So just be mindful of that. When you think about pine trees, just remember that in 20 years, they're not going to be doing that thing that you thought you planted it for. But here's another one that does that. American arborvitae does stay green all the way to the ground. Again, it likes to be high and dry. It does not like wet feet. And our last one here is Carolina hemlock. And I used to say the Canadian hemlock, that used to be the one. But within about the last 15 years, it's gotten too hot here, too hot and too dry. So I can no longer recommend the Canadian hemlock. And the Carolina hemlock, we're at the northern edge of its domain. So if you planted this, you'd want to make sure it was out of the wind. So you'd want to plant it on close to the house, near to a place where you're protected from that northwest wind, and give it some shade. The reason I'm saying that we just shouldn't be thinking about the Canada hemlock anymore is because of climate change. And so what's going to be happening is in my lifetime here, we've already gone from zone 6 to zone 6.5. In the next, 15 to 20 years, we'll be zone 7. And all of a sudden, the Carolina hemlock will be doing better. It's the reason why we can't grow sugar maples anymore. We can't grow gray birch anymore. We've had to go to river birch. So we are beginning to see the effects of climate change. And so I'll end. Oh, actually, no, I have one more. Yeah, that's right. I did. Yeah, for the last here, I wanted to just give you a sense of where can you get some of these things, because that may be one of your questions. Well, there are lots of big nurseries around here that have lots of goodies, and most of them are exotic. Just have to look for them. The Maryville Garden Center is one of the bigger ones. They have several branches. The closest one is in Falls Church. Meadows Farms, same thing. Huge operation, multiple nursery yards. The closest one is Annandale. A place you might not be familiar with. It's across the river in Prince George's County. Patuxent Nursery in Bowie is very good. And then there's two that are smaller and they're closer. The first one is Green Streets in Alexandria. This is in it's at the intersection of King and Braddock and Quaker Lane in, I guess you'd call it, West Alexandria. And they have lots of exotics. But they have a big enough selection that, again, if you dig, you can get there, you can get into it and find and the last one I'll lead with here is called Nature by Design. This is a very small boutique natives only nursery, and it's in Alexandria in the Delray neighborhood off Route 1. And what I would tell you is it's a very small facility, but because they only do natives, if you went there in search of natives, you will find things. However, they're not a big commercial grower. So you're not going to find the commercially perfect kind of species that you find in other garden centers. And in fact, most of their offerings are seedlings or small little pots. So there's a disadvantage to that. But if you were interested in natives, that might be a good place just to go and poke around and look around. And that they have many of these species that I've talked about today, but I will tell you they have more shrubs and perennials than they do trees. Okay, and with that, we can open it to questions, and I'll.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Dennis. We have a couple of questions from the chat, and I have a couple of questions as well. One thing maybe you could just clarify, because this came up in the chat. There were some of the trees that you listed in your presentation, I think, were technically shrubs. Can you just share sort of your rationale for including those here as opposed to, in a presentation about shrubs?
Well, that they want to grow tall as trees, and I would define a shrub as something that wants to get about maybe 10 to 12 feet high and then stop. And trees, even a minor tree, can get to be 20 to 30 feet tall. So even something like a witch hazel wants to be a tree. It wants to be 20 to 25 feet tall, but when you buy it, you might think, well, this looks like a shrub because it has 17 little canes and not a single trunk.
Right. Okay. All right. So basically what you've covered here in this presentation generally tends to be those types of either trees or shrubs that are going to go for that kind of height.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Let's see. We also had a question from the chat about some of the minor trees that we sort of think of as under canopy. And yet a lot of them say that they require full sun. So how does that work exactly? Can you actually plant them, under where they're under the canopy of large shade trees, or do you need to find, a spot that
Yes.
has a little bit more sun? How does that work?
Well, no, the short answer is that yes, you can plant them. And I put some of those in there for that very reason, is that many folks have like a major tree and then grass. And the canopy is 60 feet up in the air. And there's this sort of zone of either lack of shade or lack of interest or even lack of screening from, let's say, 10 to 30 feet.
Mhm.
And so these are the understory trees or minor trees, or trees that you can plug in underneath that.
Mhm.
But again, read carefully as you read this thing. Yeah, I guess I should also say that we're going to make all of this information, we're going to make this presentation available on the website.
Yeah,
So you'll be able to read these things much more quietly, calmly, and thoroughly in the future, because some of those minor trees really do want sun, but some of them would be quite fine in the shade.
So the ones that maybe do want more sun, you're thinking those would be more appropriate for, like a wider space that maybe has a large tree with not much around it, as opposed to planting that, back in your, back forest or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Or you could, again, one of the things that we always think of in landscape design is what we call the layered landscape, where you could plant an understory tree 10 feet away from a canopy tree if it was on the south side of it. So it would get the sun that it needed, but it would be close enough that it would form what you would call a canopy plus an understory layer.
Okay, great. I had a quick question about the black gum that you mentioned earlier, because I was sort of interested in that one, but I wondered, does that also have the gumballs or some sort of similar seeds that it drops, similar to the sweet gum, or is it totally different?
No, not at all. No, it has a very innocuous fruit that doesn't do any of that harm to your bare feet.
Awesome. Okay, and then in the chat, we have, how many large trees can we accommodate on our half-acre lots? I'm assuming these are the large overstory trees.
Wow. Well, you told me there wasn't going to be any math.
Sorry.
Well, no, the general rule of thumb is that you plant shade trees between 25 and 30 feet apart. but that's to give the tree its full sort of canopy of growth and enough distance. However, when you walk through the woods, trees can be 10 feet apart from each other,
Mhm.
and that's perfectly fine. In fact, that's what defines a forest. So if your setting is a forest, then you can plant trees pretty close together. If your setting is more suburban, and there's different kind of Holland Hills setting, you would want to plant your trees a little further apart. But again, I would encourage thinking about planting trees a little closer together to get more immediate shade, to get more canopy cover. And again, just in terms of the simple science of ecological services and carbon sequestration, that we just need to be building forests.
Mhm.
We all need to be doing our part to reforest the planet, and do the best you can with what you got on your property.
Okay. Let's see. Let me have. Do exotics such as Japanese cherries serve as pollinators, even though they're not technically native?
Yes, they do.
They do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Every plant has some degree of flowering efficacy. So again, I'm not disdaining them. It's just that native plants are part of the ecosystem with which the insects are of this region. So they perform more effectively.
Let's see. We have a couple questions about wet soil. Specifically, does the Carolina hemlock tolerate wet feet? Do you have
Um,
opinion
I'm
on
going to say pretty much not at all.
that?
But where you see it in the Smoky Mountains, when you see it in these stream corridors. And you say, well, of course it must tolerate wet feet. Well, they're actually that soil is very friable, and it's actually well drained. So yes, it seems to be growing next to moving water, but it's actually in a well drained soil. And I think chronically in Holland Hills, we do not have well drained soils.
I certainly don't in my yard.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, it's not to say you can't plant a Carolina hemlock. I'm also not saying you can't do it. But what I would do is I would plant it in an area that's high and dry, not at the low point of your yard. I would plant it with at least 6 to 8 inches of gravel underneath it when you plant it, so it drains well. And I would not put any heavy clay in the planting soil, except a little bit intermixed with a good, friable, silty loam kind of soil. In other words, give the plant a fighting chance to thrive.
Makes sense. And then for something like a river birch that does like wetter soil, will it actually help dry up the soil long term? Like, does it actually um, consume more water than other varieties?
Well, it consumes, I don't know if it consumes more than other varieties that also like wet feet.
Mhm.
They will consume water,
Mhm.
but it's not going to make the soil drier as an outcome, because the soil composition is the soil composition.
Okay. Let me see. At a nursery, there are many sizes of trees from gallons or whips to 4-inch caliper. When do you recommend using which size?
Well, it depends on how old you are. No, I'm sort of kidding. But what I would say is trees grow about a foot a year. So I would advise anybody who buys a house in Holland Hills, the first thing you do is plant a few trees. And because it's going to take time for those trees to grow. So if you were doing, and again, to actually get back to answering your real question, if you were doing kind of a successional forest restoration in one corner of your yard, yeah, the smart thing would be to get a variety of trees from whips and saplings, and let it grow as a successional forest does with various sizes. If you want to see a tree produce shade in your lifetime, I would have a tendency to go with a 2-inch caliper tree. If you are having a wedding next summer, go for the 4-inch caliper tree. just go for instant shade. You'll pay lots of money for it. A 4-inch caliper tree will be $1,000 or $1,200 installed, but it will be a real tree. It'll be 20 to 22 feet tall. It will have a canopy of 12 to 14 feet, so you can get pretty much instant shade. But having said that, you would still look at it and say, wow, it's still not really a major oak, is it? It's still not a beautiful canopy tree. So the best thing you can do if you have a Hollin Hills house is take care of the trees that you have, because we have some magnificent trees, and let those continue to thrive, but always be planting. Never take anything for granted. Remember the derecho in 2012 when magnificent trees were torn down. So we have to think of ourselves as forest managers and constantly be adding trees to our yard, to our stream valley parks. It's really part of the stewardship of living in this neighborhood.
You mentioned earlier some minimum spacing away from houses. I think you said you should plant a tree no closer than 10 feet from a house. But this question is about what about property lines? Are there trees where maybe you should consult with your neighbors before you plant them close to the property line?
Yeah, that would be the neighborly thing to do, because I would argue that it's mutually beneficial. If you plant a tree 2 feet from your property line, the shade is going to convey to your neighbor's yard. But like anything, you want to be a good neighbor. And what you should be mindful of is things like planting something like, let's say, Eastern red cedar. If you planted it off 1 foot from your property line, it's going to grow to 40 feet tall and about a 10 to 12 foot canopy. That means half of that canopy is going to be on your neighbor's yard, and it will actually be an incursion into their yard because it will stay branched to the ground forever. So yeah, the neighborly thing would be to have a discussion with your neighbors and hopefully reach mutual agreement on what the character is.
All right, and then I think this will probably be our last question, unless I've missed any. And Rick, one of our board members, if you want to jump in, if you see any that I've missed, feel free to jump in. So the last question I have, which I think came as a direct message to me, do you have any recommendations as to trees that produce less pollen for those of us who suffer from allergies?
Wow, that is a good question. I don't know that I knew the answer to that, because we certainly know the ones that produce lots of pollen here. All trees produce pollen, and oaks produce. To say this, even if you planted 2 trees that had less pollen, you're still in an oak canopy forest if you live in Northern Virginia, and it's going to blow into your yard. So it's yeah, sorry, I don't know that that's a problem that you can solve within your own yard.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think maybe the thought was just to not add to it more than it's already. Certainly my yard is kind of a lost cause in terms of pollen, especially this month. It's just like each week is something else is dropping. Oh, okay. I have one more question, and then I think we will probably wrap it up. What is the best way to protect a newly planted tree from deer?
Wow. Well, you can put a little cage around it. If you go to Home Depot, you can get chicken wire and just keep it away. Well, first of all, prune it up so that the leaves are, shorter than deer. But, deer will also gnaw on the bark. And if you put a cage around it, until it's strong enough, until the bark is strong enough to withstand that, and the tree has established itself.
Okay, and then just I had a couple of follow-up questions to that. We're now hearing about the cicadas coming soon. So we had a couple of questions about what we can do, whether it's a good time to plant trees, or is there anything we can do to protect newly planted trees from the coming cicadas?
Yeah, that is a darn good question, because that only happens every 17 years. And everything I've been reading about it says, if you have a choice, don't plant this spring. Wait till the fall. Honestly, planting in the fall is better anyhow.
Mhm.
And the spring planting season is only about 45 more days. So if you were, and that's exactly when the cicadas are going to be here. The cicadas are going to be here starting in about 2 to 3 weeks. So yeah, I wouldn't tempt fate by planting a new tender tree at this time. Just, wait till fall. And the cicadas will be gone, of course.
Right. All right. And then I think that actually answered the one additional question that came in. So Rick, unless you saw anything that I missed.
I think we got them all.
All right, great. Well, oh, I just saw another one come in. Oh, that's just a thank you. So thank you everybody for attending, and thank you especially to Dennis. I really appreciated the presentation. For me, I think it's really helpful to have the photos of especially the full tree to get a better sense for what it will actually look like in your yard. And that was all work that Dennis put together for us. So really appreciate that. And I think we're all always thinking about how we can be good stewards of our yards. And so I'm happy that we had such a great turnout for everyone. I know we were going through the presentation a little bit quickly. As Dennis mentioned, we will post Dennis's presentation up on our website, and we also have a new YouTube channel that our own Rick Hefner has set up for us, where we're posting videos of these virtual discussions that we're having. So we will post this one as well. And pretty soon, probably within the next week or so, we'll let you know a date for part 2 on native shrubs. So anyway, thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday afternoon. So,
All right. Thank you all.
thank you.